From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
한반도에 더 이상
Kim Jong-un and I declared together that there will be no more war on the Korean Peninsula, and a new age of peace has begun.
History was made on the Korean Peninsula today as the leaders of North and South Korea agreed to push forward, finally ending the Korean War, and to work toward ridding the peninsula of nuclear weapons. We'll get the latest. Then we go to Capitol Hill, where embattled EPA Chief Scott Pruitt came under fire Thursday.
I just think that every indication we have is that you really should resign, and you are undeserving of the public trust.
And as the Supreme Court looks poised to uphold President Trump's travel ban, we'll speak with Karen Korematsu, the daughter of Fred Korematsu, whose challenge of the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II went all the way to the Supreme Court. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. History was made on the Korean Peninsula today as South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un shook hands at the demilitarized zone between the two countries and pledged to work to denuclearize the peninsula and to declare the official end to the Korean War. Today's historic summit marks the first time a North Korean leader has ever set foot inside South Korea. During the meeting, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un said, quote, "I came here to put an end to the history of confrontation," unquote. The North and South Korean leaders pledged to pursue talks with the United States aimed at negotiating a formal peace treaty to replace the uneasy 1953 armistice. This is North Korean leader Kim Jong-un speaking today.
We will
make efforts to create good results by communicating closely in order to make sure our agreement signed today before the entire world will not end as just a beginning like previous agreements before today.
This breakthrough comes amidst a series of diplomatic developments regarding North Korea and its nuclear program. Last month, Kim Jong-un traveled to Beijing by armored train to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Kim's first foreign trip since taking office in 2011. Kim is also slated to meet soon with President Trump in what would be the first ever meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader. Last week, North Korea announced it would stop testing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles and would close a site where at least 6 prior nuclear tests were held. This is South Korean President Moon Jae-in speaking today.
It is very significant that North Korea took a measure of freezing nuclear first. It will be a valuable beginning for the complete denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. I clearly declare that the South and North will closely cooperate for the complete denuclearization.
This morning, after tweeting against James Comey, President Trump tweeted, quote, "Korean War to end. The United States and all of its great people should be very proud of what is now taking place in Korea," unquote. We'll have more on the historic news from the Korean Peninsula after headlines. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt was grilled by lawmakers Thursday on Capitol Hill about a slew of scandals over his spending habits and ties to industry lobbyists. Pruitt faces more than a half-dozen investigations. Among the scandals, he paid only $50 a night to live in a Capitol Hill condo owned by the wife of a prominent energy lobbyist whose firm represents a roster of fossil fuel companies. Pruitt had a $43,000 soundproof phone booth installed in his office, which a government watchdog agency says violates spending laws and is illegal. Pruitt had the EPA spend $3 million on his security detail, including 18 full-time agents. Pruitt routinely travels first or business class, reportedly because Pruitt was confronted by economy-class customers angry over his policies. On Thursday, lawmakers demanded Pruitt's resignation and pressed him on reports he's retaliated against employees who raised concerns about his spending habits. This is New Jersey Democratic Congressmember Frank Pallone.
It has been reported that at least 5 EPA employees were recently reassigned, demoted, or otherwise retaliated against after they raised concerns about your spending. Is that correct, yes or no?
I don't ever recall a conversation to that end.
I'll take that as a yes.
We'll have more on Scott Pruitt's hearing later in the broadcast. The Senate has confirmed Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State in a 57-42 vote Thursday. Pompeo then rushed to the Supreme Court for his swearing-in, then to Joint Base Andrews, where he departed to Brussels for his first official trip as Secretary of State. Next, he's slated to visit Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. The White House has also released a photo of Pompeo shaking hands with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un during their secret meeting over Easter weekend, while he was still director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is slated to meet with President Trump at the White House today. Secretary of State Pompeo will not be there. The National Security Archive at George Washington University has published declassified documents about President Trump's nominee to replace Pompeo as CIA director. Gina Haspel, who is currently serving as the deputy director of the CIA. The documents provide additional evidence as to how Haspel personally supervised the torture, including waterboarding of CIA prisoner Abdulrahim al-Nashiri in 2002 at a CIA black site in Thailand, and drafted cables ordering the destruction of videotape evidence of another prisoner's waterboarding. A jury in Pennsylvania has found comedian Bill Cosby guilty of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault for drugging and sexually assaulting Andrea Constant, the former director of operations for the women's basketball team at Temple University, at Cosby's home in 2004. Constant is one of about 60 women who've accused Cosby of sexual assault dating back decades. Cosby called the Montgomery County District Attorney an a-hole, but used the first word publicly in court after the prosecutor argued Cosby should be jailed ahead of sentencing. Instead, Cosby was allowed to return to his home in Montgomery County, where he may be forced to wear an ankle bracelet if he leaves his house. The 80-year-old comedian is facing up to 30 years in prison. He'll be sentenced later this summer. Former NBC correspondent Linda Vester has accused longtime NBC anchor Tom Brokaw of groping her and trying to forcibly kiss her back in the early 90s. She says that once at the Denver bureau office, Brokaw came up behind her, put his hand on her waist, then groped her. A second time, she says Brokaw insisted on visiting her in her hotel room and then tried repeatedly to forcibly kiss her. Brokaw has denied the accusations. In Spain, thousands of people poured into the streets in cities across Spain in protest after 5 men accused of gang-raping a teen girl back in 2015 were found not guilty of rape and were convicted of only the lower charge of sexual abuse. The 5 men, who called themselves Wolfpack, lured the teenage girl into a building and repeatedly raped her while filming the assault on their cell phones. The men's lawyers claim the video footage showing the woman immobile with her eyes squeezed shut was evidence of consent. This is social worker Adriano Mampar speaking at a protest in Madrid.
To
be honest, I feel shame we are still in a country like this one. In the 21st century, they are saying this is just abuse. Just an abuse, but she had to defend herself. I feel shame.
And in more news about violence against women, the Danish inventor Peter Madsen has been sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Swedish journalist Kim Wall. He's admitted to dismembering her body and dumping her into the sea. She's a graduate of the Columbia Journalism School. In Arizona, 50,000 teachers walked out of their classrooms Thursday, shutting down hundreds of high schools in the latest massive teacher strike to protest cuts to education funding. This is educator Mary Kotnur.
Well, the bottom line is funding.
funding for education. So a lot of people think it's just for teachers' salaries, and it's not. It's funding for the schools, for our kids. We haven't had the funding stopped in 2008 and has not increased. It's for our support staff as well. So it's for everybody. It's not what some people think just for teachers.
Thousands of teachers in Colorado also walked off the job and converged at the state capital of Denver, forcing 27 districts in Colorado to cancel classes. President Trump gave a rambling 30-minute phone interview with Fox and Friends Thursday morning, in which he railed against the scandals that forced his personal physician, Dr. Ronny Jackson, to withdraw from consideration as Veterans Affairs Secretary, boasted about firing former FBI Director James Comey, claimed he'd accomplished more than any other U.S. president in history during his first year in office, and admitted that his longtime personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, had represented him in the $130,000 non-disclosure deal with the adult film star Stephanie Clifford, known as Stormy Daniels.
Michael would represent me and represent me on some things. He represents me, like with this crazy Stormy Daniels deal. He represented me.
President Trump had previously claimed he knew nothing about the $130,000 non-disclosure agreement Cohen paid to Clifford only days before the 2016 election to keep her quiet about her alleged affair with Trump in 2006. In New York City, 14 members of the group Jewish Voice for Peace were arrested at a protest in front of New York Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer's office, demanding he call for an independent investigation into the Israeli military's killings of Palestinian protesters in Gaza over the last few weeks. Israeli forces have killed at least 36 Palestinians, including 2 journalists, since the weekly Friday protests erupted on March 30th. In Wisconsin, tens of thousands of people have been forced to evacuate after an explosion at a Husky Energy refinery in Superior. At least 10 people were injured in the blast. One is in serious condition. The cause of the explosion is unknown. And in Alabama, the editorial board of the Montgomery Advertiser published a public apology for its previous coverage of lynching. The same day, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened in downtown Montgomery Thursday as a monument to victims of white supremacy in the United States. In the editorial, the board wrote, quote, "We take responsibility for our proliferation of a false narrative regarding the treatment of African Americans in those disgraceful days. We propagated a worldview rooted in racism and the sickening myth of racial superiority. We must never be as wrong as this again," unquote. The Montgomery Advertiser was among many white-owned newspapers across the United States that failed to investigate and at times even celebrated the white mob violence that killed thousands of African Americans throughout U.S. history. Instead, it was black journalists, most notably Ida B. Wells, who exposed the horrors of lynching to the world. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. History was made on the Korean Peninsula today.
Kim Jong-un and I declared together that there will be no more war on the Korean Peninsula, and a new age of peace has begun.
Those were the words of South Korean President Moon Jae-in as he held a historic summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. After shaking hands at the demilitarized zone between the two countries, the two leaders pledged to work to denuclearize the peninsula and to declare the official end to the Korean War. Today's historic summit marks the first time a North Korean leader has ever set foot inside South Korea. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un wrote in a guest book, "A new history starts now, an age of peace from the starting point of history." Kim and his South Korean counterpart pledged to pursue talks with the United States aimed at negotiating a formal peace treaty to replace the uneasy truce that was brokered after the 1950-53 Korean War. This is North Korean leader Kim Jong-un speaking today.
우리가 오늘 북과 남이 전체 인민들과
We will make efforts to create good results by communicating closely in order to make sure our agreement signed today before the entire world will not end as just a beginning like previous agreements before today.
Today's breakthrough comes amidst a series of diplomatic developments regarding North Korea and its nuclear program. Last month, Kim Jong-un traveled to Beijing by armored train to meet with President of China, Xi Jinping, in Kim's first foreign trip since taking office in 2011. Kim is also slated to meet soon with President Trump in what would be the first ever meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader. Last week, North Korea announced it would stop testing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles and would close a site where at least 6 prior nuclear tests were held. This is South Korean President Moon Jae-in speaking today.
It is very significant that North Korea took a measure of freezing nuclear first. It will be a valuable beginning for the complete denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. I clearly declare that the South and North will closely cooperate for the complete denuclearization.
This morning, after President Trump tweeted against James Comey once again, he then tweeted, "Korean War to end, the United States and all of its great people should be very proud of what is now taking place in Korea," unquote. We go right now to Hawaii, where we're joined by retired U.S. Army Colonel, former State Department diplomat Ann Wright. She's a member of Women Cross DMZ, a group of international peacemakers who've been calling for an end to the Korean War. Ann Wright, talk about your response to what's just taken place on the Korean Peninsula. Did you ever think you'd see this day?
Holy smoke, no. This is just really remarkable. The last 12 hours have just stunned everyone of the incredible work that's been done by the South Korean government with the North Korean government. And for them to have been able to come out with a communique, an agreement that is stunning, that has, I mean, I couldn't have written it any better. If what all of the wants that we of the world who want peace for the Korean Peninsula who could have written everything down, we couldn't have added anything more to what they've come up with. It's really a beautiful, beautiful agreement, worked very hard by both governments, and I certainly hope the United States government will agree with all parts of it, and that indeed the people of Korea will finally have peace on their peninsula.
As you mentioned, this really has been pushed forward by the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in. He campaigned on this, and he has pushed very hard for this meeting. What is actually in the document that they signed, from the economy to denuclearization?
Indeed, it's breathtaking, the amount of things that are in this communique, from everything from denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula to a peace treaty, to no more war on the Korean Peninsula, to establish a peace regime, to have family reunification starting on August 15th, to connect railroads and roads, to cease all hostile acts in land, air, and sea, to transform the DMZ into a peace zone, to have a maritime peace zone in the western northern limit of the area, to hold military talks in May, that President Moon will go to North Korea in the fall, and to say that there will be disarmament in a phased manner as tensions are alleviated. So it's a really beautiful, beautiful document that will require a lot of work, that's for sure, a lot of commitment to make sure that this doesn't get derailed in any way, but it's really a very comprehensive statement of peace for the Korean Peninsula.
Now, you're a retired U.S. Army colonel. You quit the State Department over your opposition to the war in Afghanistan. You are a fierce critic of President Trump. But do you believe that President Trump deserves credit for some of what has taken place today?
Absolutely. 99% of the things that President Trump is doing, I don't agree with. But even when he was running for office, when he said, "I will talk to people, I will talk to Kim Jong-un," it was like, well, that's a very good statement. And indeed, he's followed through saying that he will. And I certainly hope that they do have a very good summit in late May or in June. It's very important that the United States follow through with what the South Korean government and the North Korean government have done. And I certainly wish President Trump goodwill for this. And I wish him goodwill if he would approach other aspects of our globe for peace, for the better environment, for keeping our planet safe for everyone. But yes, he deserves a little bit of credit for this, and I'll give it to him.
As the Korean leaders embraced each other on the demilitarized zone, the White House released the photograph of Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State nominee at the time. He has been approved. And Kim Jong-un in that secret Easter Day meeting. The significance of that, Ann Wright.
Well, as the director of the CIA at the time, to have sent the intelligence chief of the United States instead of the Secretary of State, although by that time Tillerson, I believe, had already been fired. But President Trump, having in mind the nomination, I guess, of Mike Pompeo to become Secretary of State, it does put him in a position that he's at least met Kim Jong-un, and hopefully they will develop some sort of a relationship so that the United States and North Korea can have a reasonable relationship. It's very important that we give credit where credit's due, and I hope not only is he able to smooth out relations with North Korea, keep relations with South Korea, and I hope he's able to rebuild the State Department, which so desperately needs to have some attention from the Trump administration. And
what does this mean for something like 28,000 troops in South Korea, U.S. troops in South Korea today?
Oh, I can imagine that those 28,000 troops are just breathing a sigh of relief. I mean, to have been assigned to South Korea with all of the tensions, it must have been very, very difficult for all the U.S. military there, as well as the civilians of South Korea, having to live under all of the rhetoric that's been going on. But I feel quite certain that our U.S. military is breathing a great sigh of relief with this agreement between North and South Korea.
Ann Wright, you crossed the demilitarized zone as a member of Women Cross DMZ in 2015. Did you think this moment can come? And do you see a unified Korea in the future?
Well, indeed, in 2015 with Christine Ahn, with whom I was with this afternoon here in Honolulu as we watched the very beginning of the talks between the leaders of North and South Korea. And of course, this has been our dream, not just Women Cross the DMZ, but all the people that have been working on the issues of the Korean Peninsula for decades. And indeed, it's a remarkable occurrence today that our dreams are really coming true. If this agreement is implemented in the way that it is written, it will really provide such a relief to both the people of North Korea and South Korea that they don't have to live under the threat of potential military action, that indeed there can be cooperation on economic areas that will help North Korea. I mean, the people in North Korea are not dummies. They are very smart people, and I think they will be able to use this opportunity very, very well to increase their standard of living, and the family reunification part of this, that the people of the Korean Peninsula who were artificially divided in 1945, that indeed they will be able to resume family relationships, and that the Korean Peninsula will become a safe place, a place of peace for the world.
We are currently showing live footage of the two leaders, South and North Korea, as they hold hands, continue to embrace each other. Do you think, Ann Wright, that the crippling sanctions that President Trump imposed against North Korea drove Kim Jong-un to this point? And what do you think we could see if North Korea is opened up?
Well, the pressure that the international community has put on North Korea definitely had to have had some effect on Kim Jong-un's decision to be more open. However, I think the greater thing was that indeed, because they have developed nuclear weapons, that they feel secure that they could defend themselves from any type of regime change, which is still the policy of the United States. Although hopefully by the tweet that President Trump did this morning, regime change is no longer our policy. But I think between the confidence that Kim Jong-un had because of the nuclear program and the increased sanctions that had to be hurting, those things combined put him in a position that, okay, let's deal with the West. And I think he's dealing very well with it. And the numbers of, or the amount of natural resources that they have in North Korea, the intelligence of the people of North Korea, I mean, with all the sanctions and all the things that the international community have done to them, they still developed nuclear weapons. They still put, they developed ICBMs. They put satellites into space. I mean, it's not like under all those sanctions that they were just totally crippled. They are very smart people, and I think with a little bit of a chance that we will see remarkable things happening for the people of North Korea.
Well, Ann Wright, I want to thank you for being with us, retired U.S. Army Colonel, a member of Women Cross DMZ, speaking to us from Hawaii today about this historic development on the Korean Peninsula, the meeting of the South and North Korean leaders across the DMZ. We will continue to cover this. Tune in next week and over the weekend for the latest developments at democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Capitol Hill, where the EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, who many say has rolled back environmental regulations to an extent we have not seen in decades, was grilled on Capitol Hill. Stay with us. Time Forgets by South Korean pianist Yiruma. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt was grilled by lawmakers Thursday on Capitol Hill after a slew of scandals over his spending habits and ties to industry lobbyists. Pruitt faces more than a half-dozen investigations. Among the scandals, he paid only $50 a night to live in a Capitol Hill condo owned by the wife of a prominent Washington energy lobbyist whose firm represents a roster of fossil fuel companies. Pruitt had a $43,000 soundproof phone booth installed in his office, which the Government Accounting Office says was illegal, that it violated spending laws. Pruitt had the EPA spend $3 million on his security detail, including 18 full-time agents. Pruitt routinely travels first or business class, reportedly because Pruitt was confronted by economy class customers angry over his policies. On Thursday, lawmakers demanded Pruitt's resignation, They pressed him on reports he's retaliated against employees who raised concerns about, among other things, his spending habits. This is New Jersey Democratic Congressmember Frank Pallone.
It has been reported that at least 5 EPA employees were recently reassigned, demoted, or otherwise retaliated against after they raised concerns about your spending. Is that correct, yes or no?
I don't ever recall a conversation to that end.
I'll take that as a yes.
EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt claimed during Thursday's hearing that allegations of unethical behavior are untrue and intended to derail President Trump's agenda.
Much of what has been targeted towards me and my team has been half-truths or, at best, stories that have been so twisted that they do not resemble reality. And I'm here, and I welcome the chance to be here, to set the record straight in these areas. But let's have no illusions about what was really going on here. Those who have attacked the EPA and attacked me are doing so because they want to attack and derail the president's agenda and undermine this administration's priorities. I'm simply not going to let that happen.
For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Emily Atkin, a staff writer at The New Republic. Her latest pieces include Scott Pruitt is forced to confront reality, and the EPA is acting like big tobacco. Also with us from Berkeley, California, is Michael Brune, the executive director of the Sierra Club. Emily Atkin, let's begin with you. Talk about yesterday's hearing. Talk about the allegations against Pruitt and the more than half-dozen Inspector General investigations of the sitting EPA administrator.
Sure. Yesterday was sort of a master's class in the art of deflection and denial of, like you said, the fact that there are a dozen investigations going on regarding the administrator's behavior. Scott Pruitt sat in front of Congress for 6 hours yesterday and basically said he either wasn't responsible for the scandals that are facing him, or he didn't know about them at all, or they were being blown out of proportion. I don't think that he
didn't know about where he lived, that he was paying $50 a night to energy lobbyist family to stay in an apartment where, if he doesn't stay there that night, he doesn't have to pay $50
well, his deflection
a night.
For that was different. You know, his deflection for that was, well, the EPA Ethics Council said that this was fine. What he didn't know about was, say, was whether or not his staff that had been relocated was a retaliation for anything. He said, oh, well, that was just because they had performance issues. He didn't know whether or not there was a $43,000 soundproof booth installed in his office. He didn't know it was that expensive. It was, like I said, a master's class in deflection, and I don't think he actually swayed anybody that wasn't already convinced either of his guilt in all of these matters or of his innocence.
I want to turn to Democratic Congressmember Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico questioning Scott Pruitt.
Mr. Pruitt, today you repeatedly blamed your chief of staff, your chief counsel, career officials, and others. Yes or no, are you the EPA administrator?
I said that in my opening statement, Congressman, and I didn't blame anyone. I just simply shared facts with you as a
Mr. Administrator, it's just a simple yes or no question. Sir, are you the EPA administrator?
I said in my opening statement that I take responsibility. I've made changes historically and making changes going forward, and I simply have not failed to take responsibility. I've just simply recited the facts of what's occurred.
It's a simple question, Mr. Pruitt. Are you the EPA administrator?
Yes.
Just to be clear, do you run the EPA?
I do.
Yes or no, are you responsible for the many, many scandals plaguing the EPA?
I've responded to many of those questions here today with facts and information.
Are you able to answer that in yes or no?
That's not a yes or no answer, Congressman.
It's pretty simple that it's a yes or no answer here. There is clear concern with what's been happening, not just by the entire Congress, and I appreciate you being here today, but these questions need to be asked and answered.
And we have answered them today.
And you are not the only one that has been doing these ugly things, these horrific things, these scandal-plagued things in this administration, and I hope that this is one of many hearings that this committee will have so we can get to the bottom of this and make sure taxpayers are made whole.
That's Democratic Congressman Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico questioning Scott Pruitt. Michael Brune, you head the Sierra Club. Your major concerns about Scott Pruitt, and were they addressed yesterday in this hearing?
No, of course not. Our concerns about Scott Pruitt have not ever been addressed. Because what underlies or what's underneath all of these personal scandals, whether it's the first-class flights all around the world or the 18-person security detail that gets dragged to Disneyland and the Rose Bowl, all of this stuff, the pasta-making class in Italy, the raises for EPA officials, the Republican opposition research onto his own staff, all of these things are, frankly, a lot less important than the things that Scott Pruitt is doing in his professional capacity to undermine the safeguards that protect our air and our water and our communities and our climate. Scott Pruitt personally supported the Dakota Access Pipeline, supported the Keystone XL pipeline, supported the pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords. Scott Pruitt has personally supported the undermining of the Clean Power Plan, which would limit the amount of air and water pollution coming from coal-fired power plants. He's supported and he's personally lobbied for gas pipelines to be built, gas export terminals to be built. He's personally supported the rolling back of regulations that would limit the amount of methane pollution coming from power plants and pipelines. He is the most corrupt EPA administrator that we've ever had in our country's history. We now have 200 members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate, who are calling for his resignation, and it's because he is undermining the quality of our air, of our water, of our climate, and our communities, and he is unfit to serve as EPA administrator.
Can you talk about, I want to play for you Frank Pallone, Congress member, Democrat from New Jersey.
In October 2017, right before EPA abandoned the rulemaking, Drew Wynn, a 31-year-old small business owner in South Carolina, died while using methylene chloride. Drew's brother is here today, and I want to thank him for traveling here from South Carolina and continuing to advocate for a ban of this deadly chemical. Were you or others at EPA aware of Drew Wynn's death when the agency abandoned the ban of this deadly chemical, yes or no? Were you aware of his death?
I think it's important, Congressman, to know that we have a proposed ban in place that is being considered.
Well, obviously, you're not going to admit whether you know about Drew's death. Unfortunately, in February, another 31-year-old man, Joshua Atkins, died using a methylene chloride paint stripper to refinish his bike. I learned about Joshua from his mother, Lauren, who sent me a deeply touching letter. And I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to put that letter into the record in which she states her hope that her son will be the last to die from this chemical.
Can we make sure we see the letter?
Yes, I'll give it to you right now, Mr. Chairman. Again, Mr. Pruitt, your deregulatory agenda costs lives, real people with names, with brothers, with mothers. You have the power to finalize the ban of methylene chloride now and prevent more deaths, but you haven't done it. Do you have anything to say to these families at this point?
Congressman, as I was trying to indicate earlier, there is a proposed ban in place that we took comment on that we are reviewing presently. There has been no decision at this time.
Obviously, I have nothing to say to these families. Look, you say you're going to do something, but these chemicals are still on the shelves.
Democratic Congressmember Frank Pallone questioning Pruitt at yesterday's hearing. Emily Atkin of the New Republic. Talk about the cases he's talking about here.
These were the most effective moments of yesterday's hearing, I think. What Congressman Pallone is talking about are the dozens of deaths of Americans who have inhaled paint strippers or other household items that contain methylene chloride. And what he's talking about is there was a proposed ban of methylene chloride put in place by the Obama administration right before Trump took office. A few months later, Scott Pruitt's EPA delayed that proposed ban, and as you heard him say, they're reviewing it. And that's happened across the board at EPA. What Scott Pruitt has done in terms of his policy actions is he's delayed regulations in an attempt to either repeal or weaken them later, but just put a hold on these processes. And Pallone is talking about people who died using something that they were able to buy at a regular, Home Depot or something like that. And he's asking, do you have anything to say to these people? And Scott Pruitt, I don't think he was prepared for those questions. I mean, he had a 23-page document preparing him for questions about his ethical scandals, his alleged corruption, his alleged taxpayer waste. I think he was less prepared to deal with questions like these from Pallone that cited real people affected by his policies. And you actually saw members of Congress do this all day. You saw people bring up heads of Native American tribes that are relocating due to sea level rise and asking, do you have anything to say to them about why you're delaying climate change action? Do you have anything to say to them? Scott Pruitt recently said that he thought, well, maybe climate change will actually be good for civilization. There was one Congress member who said, what are you going to say to the shell fishermen in my district who can't make a living anymore because of ocean acidification? Is he going to flourish? And Scott Pruitt did his thing that he does, which is he deflects. He starts talking about the policy. He says with respect to a lot. He does sort of the opposite thing that Trump does, which is Trump talks very simply to try and give you the point. So, you know, the common person can understand it, whereas Scott Pruitt goes into over-talking to almost confuse you and act like he's saying something when he's actually not saying anything.
This week, Pruitt had a transparency event where he didn't invite the press. But I wanted to turn to Democratic Congressman Tony Cardenas of California questioning Scott Pruitt.
The list of your failures is long, and your wasteful spending is an embarrassment to government and very offensive to the taxpayers who pay all of our salaries. This administration is so packed with unethical behavior, but yet at the same time, you have to understand that your power directly impacts health and well-being of vulnerable populations in this country. Seniors, our children, our sick, and our disabled. It's tempting to ask why you spent nearly $68,000 on hotels and travel from August through February, just in 5 months, and $50,000 on modifications to your office, including a privacy booth that cost over $43,000, and an oversized desk with ornate woodworking that costs over $2,000. But we already know that some of these purchases were made in violation of federal laws. When you appeared before the subcommittee in December, this subcommittee, you said that your phone booth is used for classified conversations and sensitive conversations with the White House. Has this $43,000 phone booth, has it been certified as a SCIF? And also, so using it are you using it for classified conversations? Is that appropriate?
It has not been certified as a SCIF, and it does provide protection on confidential communications. And I think it's important, Congressman, to know where this originated. I did have a phone call that came in of a sensitive nature, and I did not have access to secure communications. I gave direction to my staff to address that. And out of that came a $43,000 expenditure that I did not approve. That is something that should not occur in the future.
You're not taking responsibility for the $43,000 that was spent in your office. You're saying that staff did it without your knowledge?
Career individuals at the agency took that process through and signed off on it all the way through.
Okay, so you were not involved in that?
I was not involved in the approval of the $43,000, and if I'd known about it, Congressman, I would have refused it.
Emily Atkin, your response to what he's talking about here in response to Congressmember Cardenas, the transparency event where he didn't invite the press?
Sure. I mean, it's incredible to hear him say that career employees did this at the EPA with regard to his $43,000 soundproof booth. What he's saying is not only did he not approve that expenditure, knowing that Scott Pruitt has been so obsessed with his own security and secure communications, sweeping his office with bugs for listening devices. He's saying neither he nor his political staff, so the people that he brought in, had anything to do with that. When at the same time, you mentioned the transparency event where reporters weren't invited. Secrecy and security have been a hallmark of Scott Pruitt's EPA. And it's sort of mind-blowing to hear him say that he had nothing to do with something that clearly is so core to him.
The Government Accounting Office said this was illegal because expenditures of more than $5,000 had to be approved. This was $43,000. There was a soundproof booth in the EPA already on another floor, and this one hasn't even been certified as soundproof. But Michael Brune, if you could talk more about his record and how you feel the Republicans versus the Democrats dealt with Pruitt yesterday. And are you calling for his resignation?
Oh, we're most definitely calling for his resignation. He is unfit to serve as EPA administrator, and we've been pleased by the small number of Republicans thus far in the Senate, but an increasingly large number of Republicans in the House that are also calling for his resignation. Look, it's clear that this is a person who should not be EPA administrator. He should never have been appointed. He certainly should never have been confirmed, and he should be removed from office as quickly as possible. And as I said earlier, this is the scandals around the phone booth or the security detail, all of the stuff with his first-class travel, the sweetheart deal to stay at a luxury condominium a couple blocks from the Capitol. All of that is an abuse of taxpayer funds, and people should be outraged by it because you're paying for it as a taxpayer. But what I believe is more concerning and was reflected in Congressman Pallone's testimony is the impact that Scott Pruitt's decisions are having on you and me, the health of people all across this country. Right now, Scott Pruitt is working on undermining the Clean Car Standard, which is a standard that is supported by 90% of Americans, Democrats and Republicans, because it cuts air pollution, cuts water pollution and climate pollution, and it saves people money. What it does is makes cars more efficient. It helps people to transition to cleaner vehicles, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, electric vehicles, or simply more fuel-efficient vehicles that reduces our dependence on oil, and it makes innovating industries in the auto sector more successful. This is one of dozens of things that this EPA administrator is doing. He either is denying science, denying climate science, he's trying to muzzle scientists, just dissolving scientific advisory boards. He's trying to undo safeguards, or he's cutting the enforcement of those safeguards. The enforcement at the EPA is down by 40%. So we are challenging this EPA administrator. We're challenging him in court every day, but we also need to see him removed from office as quickly as possible.
And we have 30 seconds, Emily Atkin. Your latest piece is headlined, "The EPA is acting like big tobacco." How?
EPA, Scott Pruitt, proposed a rule to change what kind of science the EPA can use in order to create regulations. It's marketed as a transparency policy, so the administrator is saying that only studies that use open data can be used. That actually disqualifies the vast majority of health research on air pollution, lead pollution, climate change. And what I describe in the piece is that this is a tactic lifted directly from big tobacco when they tried to disqualify research about the health effects of tobacco in order to avoid paying financial penalties. And I should just add that the tobacco lobbyist who worked on that for big tobacco is now taking credit for that for the EPA.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Emily Atkin, The New Republic, Michael Brune, Sierra Club, and Emily will link to your pieces at democracynow.org. Coming up, as the Supreme Court looks poised to uphold President Trump's travel ban, we'll speak to Karen Korematsu, the daughter of Fred Korematsu, whose challenge of the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II went to the Supreme Court as well. Stay with us.
Say it's only a paper moon hanging over a cardboard sea, but wouldn't it make believe if you believed in me? Say it's only a canvas sky hanging over a muslin tree, but it wouldn't be make believe if you believed in me. Without your love, it's a honky-tonk parade. Without your love, it's melody played in a penny arcade. It's a Barnum and Bailey world, just phony as it can be. But it wouldn't be make-believe if you believed in me.
Paper Moon by Frances Chicky White. She began her singing career in a Japanese internment camp at the age of 15 years old. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S. Supreme Court looks poised to uphold President Trump's travel ban, which blocks most people from 7 countries, including Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, from entering the United States. During oral arguments on Wednesday, Justice Anthony Kennedy appeared to side with the conservative side of the court. Lower courts have repeatedly ruled against versions of Trump's travel ban, saying they were unconstitutional and in violation of federal immigration law. Among those who've asked the Supreme Court to rule the travel ban unconstitutional are the children of Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. Joining us now is one of those children, Karen Korematsu, daughter of civil rights icon Fred Korematsu, who was detained for refusing orders to be sent to an internment camp set up for U.S. residents of Japanese ancestry. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Last year, Karen Korematsu wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post headlined, "My father resisted Japanese internment. Trump's travel ban is just as unfair." In the op-ed, she wrote, "Trump's travel ban echoes the World War II incarceration camps, separating those of a different ethnicity under the guise of national security. Both executive orders under Trump and Roosevelt target and discriminate against minorities, tear families apart, and preach intolerance. And I believe we'll soon see they are found to be unconstitutional," unquote. For more, we go to Austin, Texas, where Karen Korematsu joins us, founder and executive director of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Karen. Explain what happened to your father and why you see this so closely correlated with what's happened in the Supreme Court this week.
Good morning, Amy. It's good to be with you. Thank you for bringing focus to this issue. And to my father, he thought in 1942 that the executive order 9066 that was hastily issued, I might add, by President Roosevelt, violated our civil rights as Americans. All due process of law was denied. And he thought it was wrong as an American citizen to be incarcerated when he had done nothing wrong. And so that's why he fought his case all the way to the Supreme Court.
And talk about what happened to you.
Well, I learned about my father's Supreme Court case actually in high school when my friend was giving a book report about the Japanese American incarceration camps. And then she said, but there was this one man that resisted the military orders, and it ended up to be a landmark Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus the United States. And she didn't say Fred at the time, and it wasn't until after class that she said that was about my father.
Talk about your internment, Karen.
Well, I wasn't actually born in one of the camps at the time. I became aware, of course, with my father telling me after I learned about this in school. But when the evidence was found in 1983 that proved that there was no military necessity for the Japanese Americans to be incarcerated, his case was reopened under a kind of little-known legal term called coram nobis, which means an error has been made before the court. And a legal team took on the case as pro bono work, and my father's federal conviction was overturned or vacated in 1983. But it still stands on the Supreme Court record. And that's the warning that after all this time, next year it will be the 75th anniversary of my father's Supreme Court case. And this is the caution that we wanted the courts to be reminded of.
I want to turn to a clip from the documentary produced by Eric Paul Fournier. It's called Of Civil Rights and Wrongs, the Fred Korematsu Story.
One day my girlfriend wanted to meet me. I was waiting for her at the corner, and she didn't show up. I ran out of cigarettes. So like a darn fool, I went across the street to the drugstore, and someone recognized me, I assumed, because when I came back and I was standing there for another 5 minutes, then the police came. And they looked around and looked at me and said, "Did you see any short Japanese person around here, Asian?" I said, "No." He looked at me and says, "Well, let me see your identification." By that time, the 2 MPs came in the military. And he says, "We have to take you to the city hall." After I was arrested, I never did see my girlfriend again. So there must have been something going on in there, but I didn't know.
Karen Korematsu, talk more about what Fred Korematsu is saying, your father.
Well, actually, I'd like to correct the title is of civil wrongs and rights. And then my brother, Ken Korematsu, was also co-producer of the 2-time Emmy Award documentary. And so I said, my father thought it was wrong to be, to be put in prison when he had not violated any laws. And so he never gave up hope that someday he would be able to reopen his case. And the result of the 1983 decision was governmental misconduct. And that's what relates to the executive order and what's happening with the Muslim travel ban now. And that's what we're wanting the court to be aware of and to stop repeating history. It's important that we remind the courts that there needs to be a separation between judicial and executive. And it's an overreach, we feel, on the president's part. And being in the Supreme Court on Wednesday and to hear the justices and the argument was really alarming in some ways, because they could have addressed a lot more of the situations that are immigration violations and people's civil rights and civil liberties that we want to uphold.
Neil Katyal, who is the attorney representing the state of Hawaii in the Supreme Court this week, tweeted, quoting your amicus brief, "The government's arguments in this case bear a disturbing similarity to the arguments this court accepted in Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui." Explain ultimately what happened to the case from federal court to the Supreme Court, and also the compensation after decades that Japanese Americans got. Were you one of those, as a child of someone who ultimately was jailed for resisting the internment camps, who got that kind of compensation?
The case, as I said, was my father's Supreme Court case, and Hirabayashi and Yasui were also reopened under the Coram Nobis procedure. So the convictions, the personal convictions were and federal convictions were vacated, but the Supreme Court case still stands. As I said, I wasn't born in one of the incarceration camps. Only people that were. However, by the time that actually to bring recognition that this year is the 30th anniversary of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, that was the official apology to everyone of Japanese ancestry that was incarcerated, and there was reparations, but it was really the apology that everyone wanted. But you had to be living, and so people like my grandparents who had passed away, there was nothing, that they would have received, and it didn't go to the families, per se, only those two that were living. But the important reason that the reparations was needed was for education. So that's when the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund, originally sanctioned by Congress, was started so that we could educate future generations about really the inhumanity of the incarceration and what's happening today.
Karen Korematsu, I want to thank you for being with us, daughter of Fred Korematsu, head of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute. That does it for our show. A correction, it was Yip Harburg and Harold Arlen who wrote the song Paper Moon. I'm Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now! Thanks for joining us.